recent review undertaken by FSANZ confirmed the GM food definitions are now very outdated. So proposal P1055 is focused on updating those definitions so they can serve us better into the future, and importantly continue to protect public health and safety as new technologies are developed. So the first call for submissions, which was released last month, is seeking feedback on the first stage of that process, in particular our assessment and proposed approach to updating the definitions. So I'm particularly interested in the questions that we're going to be receiving today and in the submissions that will be received regarding this proposal, because the proposed approach is a unique first for FSANZ. By widening the definition of gene technology and then crafting clear exemptions within that definition, we're using our world-class scientific rigor to create a clear space with appropriate guardrails within which industry can confidently innovate and progress their products, while consumers can continue to be confident in the safety of these foods. So I'm excited to get started, and I'll just give some quick housekeeping announcements. And I wanted to make mention that this meeting is being recorded, which you've probably already identified from the background noise saying that that's already commenced. I also would like to ask participants who have questions throughout, please feel free to submit your questions into the Q&A box. You'll see three little ellipses down the bottom at the far right. If you click on that, you can open up the Q&A feature and then type your questions into there. And that's the feature that we'll be using to ask questions during the panel session. Feel free to use the chat for other commentary, but we'll be focusing namely on the Q&A part when we get to the questions. Lovely, and that concludes my housekeeping. I'll now hand over to Shai Joseph, who will be giving an overview of P1055 and highlighting the key points from the first call for submissions report. Thank you so much, and over to you, Shai.
Thank you very much, Sandy. So I'll jump right into that. And so like Sandy has said, genetic technologies have been rapidly developing over the last 20 years. So we call these technologies new breeding techniques, or NBTs. And we like to think of them as as tools in a toolbox. And these are basically new methods which are being used to change the genetic makeup of plants, animals, microbes, which are then used for food. Now, genome editing is just one of those tools in the toolbox and is an example of an NBT. So the problem we have is that while we have this rapid development of technology, these definitions have been put in place over 20 years ago and were intended to capture the type of GM foods and technologies which were present at the time. And so as you can see in the schematic down the bottom over here, what these definitions do is that they capture GM food in this net over here for pre-market safety assessment. Now, once FSANZ determines that these foods are safe, they can then enter the marketplace. Now, for NBT foods, it's unclear whether or not these foods will enter the net or bypass the net and enter directly into the marketplace without a pre-market assessment. So this provides a real regulatory problem. The definitions are unclear and outdated. There's regulatory uncertainty and possibly gaps in regulatory coverage. So this provides a real-world problem, as uncertainty may deter investment in new technologies, delaying or stifling innovation. And this is important because NBTs may benefit the agri-food sector as well as consumers. Now, due to this problem and based on recommendations from the previous FSANZ review completed in December 2019, we have initiated proposal P1055 in February 2020, which is to revise and update the definitions in the code. Now, these definitions will continue to protect public health and safety as new technologies are developed. I'll also mention that the labeling approach for GM food is out of scope of this proposal. Now, this proposal has three main objectives. The first one being to improve clarity about what foods are captured for pre-market approval. The second being better address new and emerging technologies, so not just NBTs now, but looking at technologies into the future. And also the third one being to be risk proportionate. Now, the basis of this proposal is the science, and specifically the safety assessment, which we've had input into from our expert advisory group on new breeding techniques. And the question wasn't necessarily whether or not the definitions currently will capture NBTs, which was addressed in the previous review, but is pre-marketer safety assessment for all NBT food justified based on the risks that they pose? Now, the approach that we took was a comparative one, and that's similar to what we do with GM food. We compare GM food with conventional food. And we've done that here. So we've taken NBT food as a broad class of product and compared it to conventional food with a history of safe use. And we've put up three major results here on the slide. So in terms of genome changes from new breeding techniques, what the safety assessment found that they are identical, equivalent, similar to those from conventional breeding, GM techniques, and that occur naturally. There's nothing inherently unique that NBTs do to the genome. We've seen these changes before. Now, we've thoroughly examined unintended changes, and specifically for NBTs, we looked at off-target effects for genome editing. And what we found is that for unintended changes from NBTs, they pose no greater risk than other methods. Overall, it's important to remember that the risk is low. And finally, for risk, focus should be on the final food product characteristics. Now, if we remember back to the graphic of the first slide, we have the apple. So if we focus just on the apple, that's where the risk is going to lie, and not necessarily the technologies or the tools which we use and previous steps removed. So the conclusion from the safety assessments are as follows: that an NBT food with the same product characteristics as conventional food has the same risk as conventional food. And there's no basis for subjecting such food to pre-market safety assessment. And this leads on to excluding such food from revised definitions and establishing product-based criteria for determining equivalence to conventional food. Now, while the safety assessment has focused on NBT food, some of the conclusions can be extrapolated into other products, for example, refined ingredients. So specifically, refined ingredients derived from GM food may also have the same or identical product characteristics as equivalent ingredients from conventional sources. And we listed a few examples there in the dot points. So for example, processed ingredients derived from whole food, where through the refining and purification process, you're removing all DNA and protein, including the foreign DNA. And the second point being substances added to food for a specific purpose. And I'd like to highlight this with an example on the right, whereby if you have a GM sugarcane or a non-GM sugarcane, you're doing a refining process to the sugar, a purification process, and you end up with sucrose, which is chemically identical. It doesn't matter which source it comes from, the chemical structure, as you can see, is identical. So the safety assessment also supports excluding certain refined ingredients from revised definitions. Now, we can also apply the safety assessment outcome to a variety of different products. And when we end up with two category of products, one which are captured by revised definitions, and another one which are excluded from the revised definitions. And so let's start with what is captured. We have GM food. Now, this is out of scope of the proposal, so they will be captured by the revised definitions. We have NBT food when they're not equivalent to conventional food. We have refined ingredients from GM food that contain novel DNA and protein. So if they contain novel DNA and protein, they're not identical to refined ingredients from conventional food. And the list of excluded from revised definitions, we have food from null segregants. Null segregants are organisms which in the past have had a genetic modification, but through conventional breeding, they don't anymore. And so the food from these organisms are identical to conventional. The second point being NBT food are identical to conventional food. And the final point being refined ingredients from GM food are identical to refined ingredients from conventional food, where there's no novel DNA or protein. So in addition to the science, as well as the safety assessment, we have to consider other factors when devising a proposed approach to revising the definitions. So these include the following: the current regulatory and policy approach to existing GM foods. So we will be continuing to require pre-market assessment and labeling of GM foods. And we'll be continuing to exclude conventional foods. So these have a history of safe use. Now, in addition to looking at the technologies which are present now, we also have an eye onto the future. So we're looking at the new risks that may be posed into the future, for example, from the field of synthetic biology, whereby you can design completely new organisms from scratch. A key consideration is also implementation and enforcement. We need definitions that are clear and enforceable, implementable, that can be implemented, and also the ability to distinguish between NBT foods and conventional food. And that will help with the enforcement. Another consideration of what we've discussed quite a bit in the consultation document is the alignment between food and gene technology regulations. So what we found is that there are very different statutory objectives from all these regulations, as well as different risks to be managed. So for example, the risks from a genetically modified organism might be for the environment, but for food, you have to consider in particular safety of that food for consumption, for human consumption. So we focus on the best approach for food. We've also kept an eye on international developments. This is a very dynamic space. And with many countries either implementing or have implemented or are going out for consultation with new approaches or policies or definitions for new breeding techniques. So taking all this into account, taking the science, the safety assessment, as well as other considerations, the FSANZ assessment is as following. That NBT food and refined ingredients should not be GM food for co-purposes if they're equivalent in product characteristics and risk to conventional food with a history of safe use. And a key thing to mention here is that even if a food is excluded from pre-market assessment as a GM food, it may still be captured by other parts of the code and require pre-market assessment. So for example, food may not be a GM food for code purposes, but it may trigger the novel food standard, for example. And the final point here being GM food will continue to require pre-market safety assessment and approval under revised definitions with approved GM foods subject to mandatory labeling. So the proposed approach that we've got in the call for submission document, we've also got definitional criteria there, is that definitions proposed to be amended as follows. So firstly, to revise and expand the process-based gene technology definition, so that is, in essence, expanding that net to capture all methods for genetic modification other than conventional breeding. And the second point being to revise the definition for food produced using gene technology to include specific product-based exclusion criteria. So foods not meeting those exclusion criteria would require an application to the FSANZ. So in addition to these regulatory measures, we've also considered and proposed supporting non-regulatory measures. They include guidance material for developers, for example, providing further information on the exclusion criteria, and also for the formulation of an advisory committee modeled on the ACNF model, which is the Advisory Committee on Novel Food, to provide opinions about the regulatory status of specific products under revised definitions. So in terms of all the documents that can be found on the FSANZ website, this includes the safety assessment, some of which I talked about today, and a plain English summary. In the consultation document, we've got the proposed approach and definitional criteria, which will be really, really interested to hear from you. We've recently published, well, in fact, just yesterday, we've published consumer research. So that includes a literature review as well as focus groups, which look at consumer attitudes to new breeding technique food. And we also have a range of communication materials, such as fact sheets and videos on our website. Now, we'll remind you that the closing date for the first call for submissions is the 3rd of December, so please get your submissions in. And just to finish off, and this is my last slide, that we are at the first of 2 call for submissions. So you'll have another chance to comment in 2020, and that'll be on the drafting, as well as the fact that throughout this process, we'll continue with our stakeholder engagement as well as our communication. And with that, I'll stop there and hand back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shai. Really appreciate you running us through that. I'm sure it provides a really good basis for people to start thinking through what questions they might like to add. A reminder, please feel free to add your questions into the Q&A box. And while people are doing that, I might start us off. And I'll start us off by a question to Crystal. So what impact if any, will the work currently being undertaken to modernize the food reg system, particularly with the FSANZ Act review, have on P1055?
Thanks, Sandy. So we have progressed this review, this proposal, aware of the modernisation work of the food regulatory system, and in particular the review of the FSANZ Act occurring in the background. I think regardless of what happens within the modernisation work in the food regulatory system, the review of the definitions was required to ensure that they are fit for purpose for now and into the future. The work that has been undertaken in relation to this proposal aligns quite well with the outcomes coming through in the review, in particular ensuring that the scientific basis is robust and strong and that the work that we do stems from that science, and in taking a very risk proportionate approach and making sure that we are focusing on those things with the highest risk versus those which are similar to conventional foods. So noting this, we have progressed this proposal to the first call for submissions, but as always, we'll monitor what's going on in terms of the modernisation work in the background. Thanks, Sandy.
Thank you. And I've got one for you, Glenn. A topic of interest often relates to labels. And so I'm interested in understanding why the decision was taken to make GM food labelling out of scope for this proposal.
Thanks, Sandy. Haere mai, te mana kaonga kai, ahi today, me Aotearoa. So, yeah, really good question, and I know it's of great interest to consumers, but essentially it's been taken out of scope here because we're not proposing anything to be different moving forward. So, I was just actually recently reviewing labelling logic, the Blue review of food labelling from 2011, and that certainly underlined the 20-year-old approach that we've taken to labelling via the Food Standards Code. The labelling logic review was undertaken in 2011 and endorsed by government in terms of particularly foods where there's altered characteristics or indeed novel DNA. They should be labelled so that consumers can make their own decision about whether or not to consume those. So in a nutshell, we're not proposing to change anything, so therefore it's considered out of scope in terms of the core issues here, which are around figuring out what the best definitions for GM food are moving forward, given the arrival of these new techniques.
Thanks, Glenn. Appreciate that. Lisa, one for you. How does the approach that FSANZ is proposing fit with what's happening elsewhere in the world?
Thanks, Sandy. Yeah, look, and Shai in his presentation, he mentioned that the international situation is still quite fluid, and we're obviously keeping a very close eye on developments there. What we have noticed, particularly over the last 12 to 18 months, is there is an increasing trend towards approaches that have either been adopted or are proposed to be adopted that recognise that some of the products from NBTs do not require the pre-market sort of scrutiny in the form of a safety assessment that has been traditionally applied to the older GM type of products. So we are seeing a number of approaches adopted around the world that are allowing exclusions of certain types of products. So what we're proposing certainly is consistent with that trend, but I will make the point though that each country is sort of doing it slightly differently, and that all depends on what the existing regulations are within that country, and of course some countries have developed entirely new regulations to deal with these products as well. So there's quite a lot of dialogue happening internationally in this space, and we're well connected into that dialogue and continue to monitor it. But I would say we're broadly in step with what's happening elsewhere.
Thank you, Lisa. One is getting right into the refined food from GM. So a question is, how will you verify purity and no presence of minor contaminants of protein DNA? Shall I hand that to you, Lisa?
Yes, you can hand that to me. So that is the criteria that's basically would be an outcome-based standard. So that is not something that FSANZ would be going about in individually verifying those things. So that would be a standard that manufacturers who are producing those ingredients would need to determine themselves to see if they comply or do not comply with that, and then make a decision based on that whether they need to submit an application or not. And recognising, so for example, in the case of a food additive or an enzyme, even if it's not captured by the revised GM food definitions, they may still have to submit applications to us in relation to them being a food additive or a enzyme processing aid.
Great point. Thanks, Lisa. This next one I'll hand to Crystal. What were the overall findings on the consumer research on new breeding techniques?
So the consumer research, I understand, was published yesterday, which is an exciting piece of all of this work. We are very cognizant of the views of consumers in all of the work that we undertake, as well as being cognizant of the scientific evidence base that we have here. So that research was published yesterday, and people are welcome to review that. In terms of what we found, I think the overall trend is that consumers are becoming more comfortable with genetic techniques, in particular as they relate to environmental and sustainability issues. I think they are less concerned with the particular type of modification. So if you were to talk to consumers about whether it's a new breeding technique or a genetic modification and all the different types, they don't necessarily see differentiation in those types. What they see is the entire consideration of this. So they are getting much more comfortable with this. They are expecting government to ensure that the safety of these techniques is undertaken and that we are doing our role there. And they put a lot of trust in the government to undertake that role. So that's a high-level snapshot, but the consumer research is certainly out there, and I'm not sure if Glenn wanted to add to that one at all.
No, that was an excellent answer, Crystal. Well done. I just think that it's really important that we do monitor consumer sentiment as we progress. Of course, we'll have regard to every single submission that's made, but it was good to be able to put that out yesterday and make that available for people to see. Very interesting to get that work done so that it informs our development in this area moving forward.
Yeah. Thank you, Glenn. Great that piece of work got released in such good time. The next question that we have is that there are only 2 specific questions in the consultation paper, read costs and benefits. Can you enlarge on the feedback you seek for this? I think that's a great question so that people can understand exactly what would be really useful to submit.
So as mentioned, this is the first call for submission, and it will be one of 2 that we have in this area. And whilst we've got 2 specific questions, we are seeking feedback on the overall proposed approach that we are taking here and on any level of detail that we've provided in the documents here. So the feedback is broad. We will take on board all the feedback that we receive and attempt to mould this into what we take forward in a second call for submission. So whilst, yes, we have focused in on 2 specific questions, actually what we're seeking is wider views around the work that we're undertaking here.
Thank you. Sorry, another question for Crystal, and I'll try to find something that can share the love around. This one relates to much of the criticism of GM foods as environmental, and the modernization work that you'd mentioned earlier speaks to environmental factors. So why isn't that considered part of the proposal?
So I'm hopeful that everyone's aware of the FSANZ role and remit in relation to GM food. It is very much focused on food safety, and that is foods that are in the general food supply. So the environmental aspects, we have independent regulators, including the OGTR here in Australia, which deal with those environmental impacts. So our proposal is not dealing with those because our role in this system relates to food safety.
Thank you. Will exclusions likely be self-determined or need to be ticked off by FSANZ? I think that's a great question. I'll pass that one back to Lisa, please.
Thanks, Sandy. Yes, that is a great question, and it sort of gets to the crux of this new approach that we're proposing. So in terms of deciding whether a particular product meets the exclusion criteria, ultimately that will be up to the developer of the product to determine that. And of course, Shai mentioned that we intend to develop guidance specifically around that for developers. And in addition to that, we are having discussions also about the formation of an advisory group, so that if there is uncertainty for developers in terms of whether they do or do not meet the exclusion criteria for their product, then they can seek further advice in relation to that by seeking an opinion from the advisory committee. There's still details around that to be worked out, but that's essentially how we propose it will work.
Thanks, Lisa. I'll come back to you in a second with another question, but I did want to answer one comment somebody's asked about. Is the consumer research published, available on the FSANZ website? And I'll just reiterate that yes, it is. It's on the website, and if you look up P1055, where there's information stored online about this proposal, you'll be able to find it on that part of our website. And now, I think, Lisa, this is probably one for you as well, which relates to the question of refined foods and additives. So it's been seen that PCR can determine very low or minor traces of DNA fragments. Do you know if there's any intent to use PCR as a test for compliance, or is a more gross analysis expected to be adopted? I'm not sure if you're across any of those types of long-term plans, but I'll hand back to you.
That's not something we've discussed in great detail, but it's something that we routinely consider in a lot of our assessments relating to enzyme processing aids, for example, and other foods produced using gene technology, and it relates to presence so it's based on presence. So in other words, if you can detect that it's there, then that would be considered to be present. So and yes, generally speaking, you usually rely on PCR methods to determine presence.
I think that's a really good question, though. I think what we'll do is we'll keep considering that one, given that this very much is our first call for submission. Yeah. These are the types of pieces of information that we're really interested in, what people want to know about, and I can see the importance of that question. So that's great to know, and we'll keep that in our back pocket for as we progress to make sure that we can provide clarity on that one. The next question is probably for Glenn. Is there consideration of cellular and clean meat within the scope of this proposal, given the way cells are treated to grow?
Yeah, thanks, Sandy. So, the developments in food technology around the alternate productions of proteins is something that we're certainly monitoring very closely. In fact, we've already progressed one application in particular that I can think of off the top of my head. That would be the A1186, the Impossible burger. It was around soy leg hemoglobin, where there was essentially quite a close connection between that application and in terms of its GM aspects. So a lot of alternate protein, or some alternate protein technologies may include genetic modification, not necessarily, but we certainly regulate both quite closely together, and we have the developments and new technologies in mind with regard to this proposal as well. So irrespective of how new proteins are produced, If they require pre-market assessment, then FSANZ will certainly turn its mind to public health and safety in terms of having that first and foremost in the assessment and management decisions around any new applications.
Thank you very much. I'll send this next one Crystal's way. It relates to the option of broadening the scope of the Novel Foods Advisory Group being considered, as opposed to setting up a new GM advisory group. Was that part of our consideration?
It has not been, but it's certainly something that we can consider into the future, and I think that's a really useful feedback for us to receive, so thank you. It hasn't yet, but certainly something that we can consider. I think one of the things that we'd need to look at is whether that group has the right expertise to look at both novel as well as GM foods, but it's certainly not outside of the realm of possibility.
Thank you very much. And back to you, Lisa. This one relates to foreign versus endogenous DNA. So in a risk proportionate approach, what is it about foreign A that poses a higher risk than endogenous DNA, and how do we define foreign?
Okay, so that's a really good question. So we and in terms of the term foreign DNA and how we might define that, that's something that we're interested in feedback on, whether that is an appropriate term to use, whether there might be alternative terms that would be better, and also how we might define that. But in terms of risk, this question highlights a very interesting point, which has emerged when we've been looking at the science and all the different types of genome modifications that is possible with all the range of technologies that we've seen. And some of the arguments that the scientific arguments that are being used in relation to some of the newer techniques, you can also apply actually in relation to some of the older GM methods where there is introduction of foreign DNA. I think it's important to acknowledge that we have been assessing the products of those older GM technologies where there is insertion of foreign DNA, and you know, we have 20 years of conclusions in relation to those safety assessments, which say that the risks are very low and those products are indeed safe. So from a strict scientific point of view, there's not necessarily a greater risk posed by the introduction of foreign DNA. And I think as we move through this proposal work and beyond this this particular proposal, I think there needs to be some broader discussions around this category of products more generally, and whether there needs to be further reforms in relation to the existing GM or the older types of GM products, which we know from 20 years of assessing them are also relatively low risk.
Thank you. Another question, back to labeling. As I was saying before, labeling is always a very topic of interest. So the query is, would NBT food products that do not require a pre-market risk assessment require GM labeling, depending on their characteristics? I think Lisa or Glenn, I'll pass this to you.
As I understand it, and Lisa can perhaps follow on, but as I understand it, it depends on whether or not the resultant food contains any detectable modified DNA. Really, that's what it's going to swing off, and that obviously goes to what Lisa and Shai have been saying in terms of relativities to conventional foods and safety in an overall sense. But also that's critical from an enforcement perspective. We must set standards that our enforcement counterparts across the food regulatory system can enforce with some certainty. And if there's no marker, no modified DNA in the food, then there's really nothing to enforce. So in that case, labelling a labelling requirement could well be superfluous. Lisa, anything to add to that?
Yeah, so the exclusions that will apply for NBTs, if certain NBTs foods meet those exclusions, then they will not be a food produced using gene technology under the revised definition. And the way the labelling currently works in the code is that a product or a food has to first meet the definition of food produced using gene technology before those labelling requirements will apply. Now we have in developing those exclusions, and as Glenn mentioned, we have considered how the labelling applies, and so there is actually alignment between the proposed exclusions and the criteria that's applied in relation to labelling. So both are product based. So the foods that are going to be potentially excluded under the revised definitions are not ones that would, at least as far as we can ascertain at this point, are not ones that would have triggered mandatory labelling had they been captured under the definitions. I hope that's I hope that provides a clear explanation.
Thanks so much. I also have another question about will current allowances for commingling of GM, especially in agriculture, be maintained and or clarified? Is that part of the scope of this, Lisa, that you might be able to comment on? With our regards to the role of food safety, or is that more in the environmental aspects that are a bit outside of scope?
Well, I think it's not something we've explicitly considered. Commingling to the extent, I mean, obviously commingling happens with these products, and at the end of the day, I think it relates to whether there is the commingling will include a GM product that would be considered GM under the revised definitions, and therefore whether it needs to be included. An explicit permission needs to be put into the code in order for it to, be permitted to be there. This sounds a bit to me like it's touching on what we call the low-level presence, but certainly it will be no different under the revised definitions as is currently the case with the current definitions. If it's present and it meets the definition of a GM food, then there needs to be an explicit permission in the code. And typically the way that's been addressed currently is if there's potential for commingling to occur, then developers approach us to get a permission put into the code through an application process. So that will remain the same. I don't know if that was exactly what the questioner was was referring to in their question, but
I trust it was, and hopefully, yeah. If not, then by all means, feel free to follow up with a clarifier. Mm-hmm. The next question we have here is: will the advisory committee, is the intention at least, that they'll provide the outcomes of their assessment in writing? And I'm guessing that that's also in writing to be more publicly available versus writing just back to the individual. Crystal, maybe I'll pass that one to you.
Sure, thank you. So at this stage, we are just proposing that an advisory committee might be a useful way to consider this in a similar vein that we do with novel foods. I don't think we've necessarily thought it all the way through as to how advice from that committee will be provided, but certainly I think open and transparent is something that we would always seek to to achieve. So I don't think we've necessarily articulated that we'll put it in writing, but again, open and transparent is something that we always aim to achieve.
Wonderful. Now I'm just looking, and I believe that we've answered all of the questions that have popped up in the Q&A, and I'm very impressed with the breadth of questions, but when you go and review definitions from about 20 years ago, I'm not surprised that it garners quite a lot of interest in diverse questioning. So while we see if there's any further questions that pop up, I'll just make mention, or maybe I'll have somebody speak to the process of when this call for submission closes and what's next along the track.
And perhaps I can start and then hand to the team. So as previously mentioned, this first call for submission closes on the 3rd of December, and we're looking forward to receiving quite a number of submissions in response to that. It does depend a little bit on the number of submissions and the depth of those submissions as to timeframes into 2022. However, we are hoping to do a second call for submissions in early to mid 2022 based on all the submissions received. That second call for submissions will really focus in on what the changes might look like in terms of the code and what that will mean going forward from that perspective. So certainly keep watch of the website to get regular updates on where the timing is in relation to that second call for submissions. But of course, the 3rd of December is the closing date for the first call. Did you want to add anything, Lisa?
Yeah, probably just to flesh out in terms of how we might, what we're going to do with all the submissions. I mean, we're hoping, we're really keen to get as much feedback as we can on all aspects of the proposal, and particularly if there's additional data or information that people feel that we haven't considered that should have considered, and or if they feel there are particular problems or issues with some of the things we're proposing. We will be going through and identifying all the relevant issues that we will need to have regard to and address in refining the proposal, and there will be further consultation with our expert advisory group, particularly in relation to technical aspects that may be raised, and we may also, depending on issues that are raised, we may follow up with individual submitters to get further clarification and information from them. So it's difficult to sort of, as Crystal mentioned, it is difficult to sort of be definite about timing at this point. We'll probably be in a better position to make some judgments around that towards the end of the year once we've had a look through all the submissions.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Lisa. And that provided a little bit more time for a couple more questions to come through, which is great. So the first one, first kind of two that merge together relate again to the advisory panel. And the questions are, will the assessment of the advisory committee be legally binding on FSANZ and the applicant? And also, will the advisory panel have consumer representation? Glenn, should I hand to you for this one? Oh, I think you're on mute, Glenn. It had to happen once during the webinar.
We think we would be good at this by now. But yeah, in terms of advisory panels, we're really drawing on the model that is the Advisory Committee on Novel Foods at the moment, which involves collaboration between FSANZ and the enforcement bodies. So that's where the enforceability comes from. Are they binding? Well, that's really up to the enforcement bodies. FSANZ currently has no such responsibilities. But moving forward, what will the exact shape and makeup of the advisory committee look like? Well, that could depend on the outcomes of the FSANZ Act. If for example, our responsibilities were to change, then perhaps the advisory committee could incorporate some of those functions. But we don't really envisage moving forward in this space without working closely with our regulators and I would say that the advisory committee on novel foods has been going for goodness, more than a decade now. It remains a very, very popular way for people to get a quick opinion about where something sits relative to the code. And so we've really drawn on the functionality there. The other thing I'd say about the Novel Foods Committee is that we've got 15 plus years worth of records about all of the decisions of that committee. So that provides a useful basis for how to think about this thing into the future. I've also noticed some questions and commentary around methodologies. Now, I dare say that FSANZ won't be going into the detail of which methodologies might be used for detection, monitoring, or enforcement purposes. We all know that those methodologies move on and on, but in terms of why we haven't perhaps been so forthcoming about responses to questions about enforcement methodologies, that's because we don't have an enforcement role, so perhaps those questions might be best dealt with down the track or elsewhere.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Glenn. And continuing on with the advisory committee, there's a good question here about confidential information and asking if applications to the advisory committee will be considered confidential given the development of products, and they'll be at the early stage of their processes. So you might like to speak on that as well.
Yeah, certainly CCI is something we take very seriously, and it can come from applicants. Typically it does, but commercially confidential information can also be provided into the FSANZ at a range of different points, and the general principles remain the same irrespective of whether the information is given to us in the context of an application, given to us in the context of a submission, or given to us in any other context for the purposes of us doing our job. So we have very strict arrangements around the protection of commercially confidential information, which is super, because it's really important that we can have access to that information for the purposes of informing our own assessments, and the owners of that information can feel confident that they can provide it to us, knowing that we will look after it securely.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Glenn. There's a lot of interest around the proposed advisory committee. There's another question which I'll pass to Crystal, which is asking, is the idea that the proposed committee would create or be provided definitions and decision criteria and apply them as complex applications arise, or those about which jurisdictions raise questions or request a review?
So I think in terms of the development, a lot of the criteria will be contained within the code, and that's what we'll be using to look at these specific applications. Certainly the intent will be to look at applications as they're coming through, notwithstanding that if jurisdictions have particular questions about different applications, they can certainly use that committee to ask those questions. But certainly decision criteria will be part of what we're looking at here.
Lovely. All right, thanks so much. Lisa, I might throw this one to you. It asks about proposed exclusions and that they're based on no presence of GM DNA or protein. Can you comment on application of thresholds that currently apply for GM labeling re unintended presence?
Yes.
Thank you.
So that threshold is for the it only applies in a very specific situation, and that is the unintended or inadvertent presence of an approved GM product. Okay, so it is quite a separate consideration, so it's a specific exclusion under the GM labelling requirements. It is quite independent and separate from what we're proposing in terms of how the exclusion criteria would apply for the main definition for food produced using gene technology. So the two are quite separate. I hope that's clear.
Yes, excellent. Thanks so much for that. There was also a question, which I'm not sure if we've answered it yet, but it's a general one. And it asked about if we're going to be publishing the submissions that we receive on P1055. And I'll just make a comment that for all submissions that we receive, for all of our calls for submissions, they are published. And every single submission also goes in front of the board for consideration when we get to that stage, so that they can make a fully and well-informed decision on all applications and proposals. Now, I believe that that might be all of the questions that I have in front of me. And I think that the team has done a phenomenal job being extremely transparent and answering the breadth of questions that we've had here today. I'll just see if any other ones pop up in the Q&A field of today's message. And otherwise, I'll just thank everybody. There's a lot of really interesting thoughts in here. There was a number of comments that were also added, which is really important for us to just be aware of. So Fiona in particular, thanks for your comment around the issue of testing and how it's important to know that testing methodologies improve and the limits get smaller, and that changes constantly. So we're definitely keeping on top of that, but appreciate the various items that are of importance to everyone. So I think that might let us close a few minutes early. And I just want to, again, give a very big thank you to Shai for the presentation. And of course, a big thank you to Lisa, Glenn, and Crystal for coming along and fronting all the questions that got thrown at us by the panel. I hope everyone's found the webinar informative, and I really look forward to, as I said at the beginning, receiving everyone's submissions. If you have other questions in the meantime, by all means, please get in touch and let us know. We're very happy to have further discussions as we progress this important piece of work. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending today, and I look forward to seeing you later. Take care.